Alright, so this is something I never thought I'd share online, but after seeing so many of you post about strange and unexplainable encounters, I think it's finally time I tell my story. This happened a few years ago, and to this day I still get chills just thinking about it. For the sake of my sanity, I'm going to try and recount this as clearly as possible, but bear with me if I start rambling. This isn't something you easily forget. So, to give you a bit of background, I used to live in a small town in Malaysia. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing really exciting ever happens. I was in my early 20s then, fresh out of college and back home to save up some money before deciding what to do next. It was during this time that I had the experience that still haunts me to this day. My hometown was quiet, the kind of quiet that becomes eerie late at night. Most of the time, the streets would be completely empty by 9 p.m., and you wouldn't hear much besides the occasional dog barking or the distant hum of a motorcycle. But there was this one thing that was always kind of strange about my town, something that everyone knew about but no one really talked about, which was the Makcik Keropok. For those of you who don't know, Makcik is the Malay word for auntie, and Keropok are those deep-fried crackers that are really popular in Malaysia. Anyway, this Makcik Keropok wasn't just any old street vendor. People said she was different. She'd appear out of nowhere late at night, usually when it was dark, walking through the quiet streets with her basket of Keropok, calling out in a soft, sing-song voice, "Keropok, Keropok." It seemed innocent enough, but everyone knew better than to buy anything from her. The older folks said she was some kind of spirit, and buying her Keropok would bring you nothing but bad luck. I always thought it was just a silly superstition, something people made up to scare kids into staying home after dark. That was until one night. It was a Friday and I was at home with my cousin Farah. We were watching movies, laughing, and just hanging out like we usually did on weekends. Around midnight, we got a bit hungry and decided to order some food. But, of course, this being a small town, nothing was open that late. We were debating whether to just drive to the next town over when Farah suddenly went quiet. She was staring out the window, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first I thought she was joking, trying to scare me, but then I heard it too. A faint voice singing softly from outside. "Keropok, Keropok." My heart skipped a beat. There she was, the Makcik Keropok. I didn't believe in all that supernatural nonsense, but I couldn't deny the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Farah looked terrified, her eyes wide as she slowly backed away from the window. "She's outside," she whispered. "We have to stay inside. Don't open the door." I was about to tell her to calm down, that it was just some old woman trying to sell her snacks. But before I could say anything, we heard a knock at the door. It was soft, almost polite, but in the dead silence of the night, it sounded like a thunderclap. Farah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't open it," she pleaded. "Please just don't." But curiosity got the better of me. I mean, it was just a knock, right? What could possibly happen? I gently pulled my arm away from her and walked towards the door. The knocking came again, a little louder this time, and I hesitated. But then I thought about how silly this all was. Superstitions, ghost stories, it was all just nonsense. I opened the door. Standing there, in the dim light of our porch, was an old woman. She was hunched over slightly, her face obscured by a thin shawl. In her hands she held a basket filled with packets of Keropok. She looked harmless enough, just an old lady trying to make a living. I almost felt bad for being so scared. "Keropok, Keropok," she said softly, lifting one of the packets towards me. For a moment I didn't know what to do. My mind was screaming at me to shut the door and walk away, but my body seemed to move on its own. Before I realized what I was doing, I had reached into my pocket, pulled out a few ringgit and handed it to her. She took the money, her hands cold and clammy, and placed the packet of Keropok in my hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, staring after her, a strange sense of unease settling in my stomach. But I shook it off, convincing myself that it was all just in my head. I closed the door and turned back to Farah, who was watching me with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's just Keropok, Farah," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's not like anything's going to happen." But the look in her eyes told me she didn't believe that. And to be honest, neither did I. We sat back down on the couch, the packet of Keropok sitting between us like some kind of forbidden fruit. Neither of us wanted to touch it, but we also didn't want to just throw it away. It felt wrong somehow. After a few minutes of tense silence, Farah finally spoke up. "Let's just go to bed," she said quietly. "We'll figure out what to do with it tomorrow." I nodded, relieved that she was the one to suggest it. We turned off the TV, locked all the doors, and headed to our respective rooms. But as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing the Makcik Keropok's voice in my head, that soft sing-song chant echoing in my ears. Keropok, Keropok. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I did, it wasn't peaceful. I had the most vivid nightmares, strange and disturbing images flashing through my mind. I dreamt of the Makcik Keropok, her face twisted into a grotesque smile as she handed me more and more packets of Keropok. No matter how many I took, her basket never seemed to empty. I dreamt of dark, endless streets and of something lurking in the shadows, watching me, waiting for me to turn my back. When I woke up the next morning, I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a dream. But when I went to the living room, I found Farah sitting on the couch, staring at the packet of Keropok with a haunted look in her eyes. "Did you sleep?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She shook her head. "I couldn't." Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing her voice. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat there, both of us too afraid to say what we were thinking. Finally, I decided that we needed to get rid of the Keropok. Maybe then this weird feeling would go away. I picked up the packet, and the moment my fingers touched it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Felt wrong. Like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "I'm throwing this away," I said, more to myself than to Farah. She just nodded, not taking her eyes off the packet. I walked to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I tossed it into the trash. But even after I closed the lid, I could still feel it there, lurking, waiting. That's when things started to get really strange. At first, it was just small things. Lights flickering, strange noises in the middle of the night, cold drafts where there shouldn't be any. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was just paranoid because of everything that had happened. But then Farah started hearing things too. Footsteps in the hallway, whispers in the dark. We both knew that something was very, very wrong, but neither of us wanted to admit it. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of someone crying. It was soft, barely audible, but in the dead silence of the night, it was impossible to miss. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The crying was coming from Farah's room. I got up and slowly made my way to her door, every step feeling like it was taking me closer to something terrible. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Farah was sitting on her bed, the packet of Keropok clutched in her hands. She was rocking back and forth, tears streaming down her face as she muttered something under her breath. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the tone of her voice sent chills down my spine. "Farah," I whispered, stepping into the room. "What are you doing?" She didn't respond. She just kept muttering, her eyes wide and unblinking. I reached out to take the packet from her, but the moment my fingers touched it, she snapped out of whatever trance she was in and screamed. It was a blood-curdling scream, the kind that made your heart stop and your blood freeze in your veins. I jumped back, startled, and she suddenly went silent, her eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us saying a word. Then, in a voice that wasn't her own, she said, "You shouldn't have opened the door." My blood ran cold. It wasn't Farah speaking. It was something else, something that had taken hold of her. Before I could react, she collapsed onto the bed, unconscious. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? I called our family the next morning and they took Farah to the hospital. She had no memory of what happened that night, and the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with her physically. But I knew something had changed. She wasn't the same after that. She became withdrawn, quiet, like she was always on edge, waiting for something to happen. I, on the other hand, couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was still watching us, waiting for its chance to strike. I started having nightmares again, even worse than before. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that the Makcik Keropok was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with those cold, empty eyes. I moved out of that house as soon as I could, but even now, I still have nightmares about that night. I don't know what happened, what that thing was, or why it chose us, but I do know one thing. If you ever hear the Makcik Keropok's voice calling out in the night, do not open the door. Don't make the same mistake I did. Stay safe, everyone.